A Canadian mining company stands accused of violating human rights and damaging the environment in Guatemala. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The company is Goldcorp, which owns the Marlin mine in Guatemala. As the price of gold has skyrocketed amidst global economic uncertainty, the company argues it's sharing its record revenues with an impoverished community by providing jobs and economic development. The mine was opened in 2005 over the objections of indigenous communities. That should have been the end of the matter. Guatemala has ratified an international convention requiring local consent for such projects. But it proceeded anyway. Nor did that stop the World Bank from giving Goldcorp a $45 million loan for the mine in contravention of its own guidelines on local consultation. The mine employs more than 2,000 people, the majority of whom are Guatemalan. Last year, it produced 382,400 ounces of gold, earning the company $607 million. Of that, local communities receive about 5% of total revenue. And critics point to evidence of significant environmental damage and the potential for further problems as the mine reaches the end of its productive life. There have also been reports that local inhabitants have suffered skin diseases, birth defects, and miscarriages. In addition, a 2010 study found high concentrations of heavy metals in the blood of workers and local inhabitants. Those who resist the expansion of the mine have also been targeted. Al Jazeera's David Mercer has been to the department of San Marcos, where a woman says she was almost fatally attacked because of her opposition to the mine.
Diodora Hernandez is happiest working with her animals. It's the life she knows and one that she loves. So when the neighboring gold mine tried to buy her farmland to expand its operations, she refused. Then, one evening in 2010, two local men came to her house. One of them shot the 58-year-old grandmother in the face point blank. She spent 3 months in the hospital as a result.
I lost this eye, and I can't hear out of this ear.
Diodora says she was attacked because of her opposition to the Marlin mine, the largest and most profitable gold mine in Guatemala. Specifically, she says it was her refusal to sell her land, which angered some local mine workers who worried their jobs might be at risk. The two men later detained for the assault had worked for a company contracted by the mine.
All of the people in my community are compromised by the mine. They all work there.
This and other violent incidents in the community illustrate the sometimes dangerous divisions between mine supporters and opponents. Diodora's daughter Maria says she fears for her family's safety, despite the presence of a full-time policeman provided by the government.
Some people threaten you for the smallest thing. You can't speak out, but you're just defending your rights. You aren't saying things that aren't true. But if you speak badly about the mine, people say you're being spiteful and gossiping.
The Canadian-owned mine is no stranger to controversy. Just a month before the attack on Diodora, the InterAmerican Commission on Human Rights called on the Guatemalan government to suspend the mine because of concerns over human rights and the environment. Goldcorp, the mine's parent company, says they take their corporate responsibility in Guatemala seriously, especially in regards to human rights. Although no one from the company was available to meet with Al Jazeera at the time of our visit, they sent this statement. We have expressed and demonstrated that if anyone is interested in a constructive and transparent dialogue, we're all for it. And there has been enough evidence to support that statement. But they also added, we also believe that although we make tremendous efforts in our interactions with stakeholders, we believe we can be better at this, that there is room for improvement. Diodora worries that the mine will soon be all around her, but she refuses to discuss leaving her home. This land, she says, is part of her, for better or for worse. David Mercer, Al Jazeera, in the Department of San Marcos, Guatemala.
So, does the mining sector need more oversight? We approached Goldcorp to take part in our discussion, but they declined. We also asked the Mining Association of Canada and the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada to participate in the discussion, but we haven't received a response. In the studio, though, we do have Carol Muffett. He's president of the Center for International Environmental Law. From Mexico City, we're joined by Dawn Paley, a journalist who's been covering the activities of Goldcorp for a number of years. And from San Francisco, Lou Bazarski, who co-authored a report entitled Searching for Gold in the Highlands of Guatemala, Economic Benefits and Environmental Risks of the Marlin Mine. Luba, let's begin with that report then. Actually, we're going to try and very briefly summarize some of the main findings. Do correct us if we get anything wrong. But in a nutshell, the suggestion was that long-term environmental risks significantly outweigh any short-term economic benefits of the mine. The Guatemalan government receives only a small share of Marlin's profits due to weak royalty and tax systems. Royalties make up 6% of revenues, while taxes are about 15% of earnings. In comparison, South Africa charged mining companies a tax of 28% in 2010, in addition to other taxes and royalties. The report says that the environmental risk to local communities is exceptionally high and likely to increase. Water from mine drainage poses health risks due to cyanide and heavy metal contamination. This has the potential to undermine agricultural livelihoods, further impoverishing local communities. And comparatively little of the royalty and tax revenue from the mine has been invested in health, education and infrastructure, and it's unclear what will happen to those projects that are underway once the mine closes. Luba, is that about it?
You did a very good job.
Thanks. Well, actually, let's run through some of those points, though. As far as weak royalties and taxes are concerned, isn't that a problem of the Guatemalan government, actually? That's not Goldcorp's fault.
Yes, I think that's the other important aspect of the report. You know, the question is, how can a mine, which poses a pretty high level of risk, especially gold mining because they use cyanide to separate the ore from the gold, but all mining, you know, entails digging up a lot of earth. And when that earth, some of it is exposed to the air, the heavy metals in it begin to leach. There's a kind of a sulfuric acid, it's called acid rock drainage aspect that happens. So you can end up with heavy metals contamination for quite a long time. Actually, there are mines that were mined during the time of the Romans that are still leaking heavy metals like, you know, arsenum, cadmium, lead, mercury. So the risks can be pretty strong. So the question becomes, given these very high risks, and there are additional risks in the local community that we can talk about, you know, what are the benefits, and can the benefits outweigh the risks? That's really the question for anyone trying to understand the concept of sustainability in mining or sustainable development in mining. So, so here, the government is probably the only player that can ensure that there is the proper regulatory, legal, political framework that enables people to even think clearly and make decisions about trade-offs. And secondly, to reduce the risk that especially local people will be hurt.
Right, but we'll get to those specifics in a moment, but just that specific charge that Goldcorp isn't contributing enough to the local community in taxation, surely that's not Goldcorp's fault. That's actually the tax rate of Guatemala.
Absolutely. By law, the royalty rate in Guatemala for all mining projects was set at 1%. And that was done with some encouragement from the International Finance Corporation in the late 1990s to attract foreign investment. So a 1% royalty, and half of that is meant to go to local communities. A 1% royalty is very, very low. And interestingly, earlier this year, the company, Goldcorp, voluntarily raised the royalty rate higher to more like 5.5%. And they said that they will withdraw that if the market changes. And that was as a result of so much pressure. To date, the government has not been able to change that rule. So the point is that it's very hard, if the government isn't in place to do its job, really, it's hard for a company to do it all themselves.
Right.
So in fact, one of the main findings of our report is that the lack of governance capacity by the Guatemalan government is a significant risk factor for the local communities.
All right, but I'm just trying to, again, unfortunately, we don't have a representative of Goldcorp here. But of course, they would point to that voluntary increase in the revenue that they're giving back to the local community as a sign of their responsible management of the mine. In addition, we have this response to your report that you'll be aware of, Luba. Quote, in addition to paying taxes and royalties of approximately $70 million in 2010 and spending over $154 million annually on local materials, equipment and supplies, Goldcorp makes significant investments in sustainable community development in Guatemala to ensure a legacy of social and economic benefits for surrounding communities that outlive the life of mining operations. One such initiative is Goldcorp's establishment of the Sierra Madre Foundation, which coordinates activities benefiting local communities. To date, the foundation has completed in excess of 100 community projects, including building schools, computer labs, recreation halls, sport fields, roads, water and sewage systems, as well as training and hiring teachers for the local school systems. Again, Luba, I mean, the argument would be that would seem in opposition to the conclusion of your report that these were mere crumbs. I mean, there's quite a lot going on.
I didn't see evidence of a lot going on when I was there. And it's great that the company will invest in social projects. But when you compare the amount of return that is going to shareholders of the company, of Goldcorp, and we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, the actual return to the local communities is a trickle. And again, because there is so little transparency, we don't really know where a lot of monies are going that have gone to the government. When I wrote this report, we launched it in Washington, and the company actually sent a representative, which was great. But I asked them, what will happen to the clinic that they built, for example, in San Miguel, Ixtehuacan? What will happen to that clinic when the mine closes? And they said that they were talking to the Canadian government to help take it over. In other words, it'll become an aid project when the company leaves. And that's because there is so little really long-term investment going into those communities. When the mine closes, jobs down, there will be very little left to show. You know, maybe 30 teachers have been hired, that's fine, those are all good. But compared to the wealth that this mine is generating, with a proper government that could negotiate with the company, this community could be receiving a lot more.
Dawn Paley, I mean, you were just in the region. Perhaps you can tell us. I mean, I guess it comes down to the definition of sustainable development, what that means perhaps to you and what that probably means to Goldcorp and its shareholders. But what do you see when you go down there?
I mean, there's nothing sustainable about open pit mining. And what we have is a situation where groups like the IMF, like the World Bank, lean on countries like Guatemala, loan them money in return for structural adjustment, create a situation where services are no longer arriving to these remote communities, very rural, like proper education, health services, et cetera. And then the companies come in, get money from the same international finance institutions, and then they provide sort of a fraction of what, you know, a proper service would be. So, you know, you have very, by North American definition, I guess, impoverished communities, but also people who have very distinct ways of life. I mean, these are indigenous communities, people who are very tied to their ancestral tradition, speak various indigenous languages, and don't have a 9-to-5 schedule. They live from the land, and so the impacts of a project like this are tangible. I mean, disruptions in water are become significant stumbling blocks for people in their daily life.
What sort of disruptions?
People who go to the river to drink. I mean, we're talking about various things. So they're using deep water wells. So one of the complaints is that the water levels change, and then the other is contamination, as Luba mentioned. So you have a situation where people use rivers for washing, for bathing, for feeding their animals. They'll let their animals drink there, and they themselves will drink the water. And so any kind of impact on the water systems has a huge impact on people who've been living in those territories since time immemorial.
Just to put my Goldcorp hat on once more then, the Institute says that actually, Luba, your report and any allegations really are failing to take into account extensive environmental monitoring conducted by Goldcorp, the government of Guatemala, independent third parties, including the AMAC, the Community Environmental Monitoring Association, information from all these sources is publicly available. Luba?
Yes, the AMAC is actually funded by Goldcorp, and by any standards does not really meet the standard of third-party independent verification. To date, there has not been third-party independent testing, publicly available information. The information that Guatemalan government puts forward as third-party, as environmental monitoring, their information comes from Goldcorp. The independent studies that have been done in the region that have been partial, but have found enough evidence to suggest that there is cause for concern, and we have not yet seen either the government or Goldcorp step up to the challenge of true third-party verification and monitoring.
Carol Muffet, then, give us the legal view of all this. How seriously do you think corporations like Goldcorp do take their responsibilities in these areas? Are the environmental problems and the other sorts of information we've been hearing, are they factored into the cost-benefit analysis? I mean, what do you think is going on in the minds of the Goldcorp board and its shareholders as it hears? I mean, obviously these complaints have been going on for years.
Yeah. I think that Goldcorp has had a number of opportunities to prove how seriously it takes its legal obligations with respect to this mine. And I think the facts speak for themselves. The first opportunity that Goldcorp had to demonstrate how seriously it took its legal obligations was when it had the opportunity to actually engage the communities where it was planning to build the mine and seek their free, prior, and informed consent for the mine as international law requires. Goldcorp failed to do that.
But isn't that, I mean, surely, I mean, that is ILO Convention 169 and UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights and so forth. So are these completely meaningless statutes? I mean, what does that mean?
Well, and this brings us to another opportunity Goldcorp had to prove its compliance with the law. When this case came before the InterAmerican Commission on Human Rights, the InterAmerican Commission said to Guatemala, said to Goldcorp, there are serious human rights implications here. People's lands are affected, people's lives are affected, people's health is affected. You need to close, you need to cease operations at this mine while we explore it.
Is that a request, or is once they say that, is that a requirement?
This is one of the inherent problems with the international system that we deal with. We have laws that when they protect, international laws that when they protect companies are often binding and enforceable for those companies. Companies have means to assert their rights in international tribunals and before international courts. When it's individual communities being affected, when it's individual peoples being affected, the rights are still there, but often the mechanisms they have for defending them are very, very weak. And our experience.
Yeah, but the Inter-American Commission on
Human
Rights.
let me say something here. Let me say something here, because it comes back to your first question. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is a body made up of nation-state members in the hemisphere, North and South America. So when it issues a ruling, it makes the ruling to the government of Guatemala. So the suspension order came to the government, and the government had to respond to it, and they had to gather certain kinds of information, etc. And it was the government who was not willing to suspend the operations of the mine.
What about this then? I mean, even
and in fact, let me just to finish. Yeah. There have been other cases where the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has made rulings. The nation states can push back and say, we're going to leave. That's their power.
Right.
So we don't have proper enforceable international law. It's only enforceable at the national level.
All right, what about, Carol,
so
then,
the failure of the Guatemalan government is what's key here.
What about the World Bank, its international financing arm?
The IFC and the World Bank have internal policies that they have to adhere to. They have accountability mechanisms that can be invoked in
have they been invoked?
Not in this case.
Well, if I could say something about that. The loan from the IFC was not made to Goldcorp, but to the company that owned this mine before that. And they enforce their policies by simply saying, here's what you must do to get a loan from us. And one of the things they had to do, for example, was to have consultations with local communities. So they went to those communities, they had information sessions, they talked to people, and the IFC checked that off.
So it's consultation, but you don't actually listen to what they're saying. I mean, what they say doesn't really matter.
And
Well, now I understand.
So some years later, when the local communities had their own vote, when they came up to say, we don't really want this mine, and they were told, well, we had consultation, they said, we did not understand these consultations as asking for a decision by us. They were information sessions. And the IFC had actually investigated, they had an ombudsman look, and they concluded that their own policies were not properly implemented in Guatemala.
And so?
Of course, when Goldcorp bought this, well, one thing that they had to do, though, as a condition of the IFC loan, the company had to produce annual environmental and social impact reports. And that level of transparency is what enabled me as a researcher and my team to actually get a lot more data than we would with many other mines.
Right, well, that's what's so
but
interesting.
The company,
that Goldcorp itself commissioned a human rights assessment, posted on its website, and it says the company does not respect the rights of indigenous communities. It threatens those who try and form unions and so forth. And yet, I mean, that's just that. Look, Dawn, I mean, that does bring us on to another issue that we saw in the report that we just saw. The common theme in many of these regions where international mining companies are involved, intimidation, threats. Is there any evidence that these companies are actually directly involved?
Often there is. I mean, I've looked at cases in Mexico, in Guatemala, where you actually see mine employees of the local subsidiary, particularly security guards, directly involved in all kinds of attacks, intimidation, harassment of people who don't even necessarily reject a mining project, but who are, demanding more information and that their rights be respected.
So what recourse do they have, though? Actually, and in this particular case, by the way, I mean, what about with Goldcorp then? Are there any, cast iron cases which you can trace back to Goldcorp?
I mean, part of the reason why so many of these mining companies are based in Canada, like Goldcorp, is because there is no way that those same community members can sue Goldcorp in Canada. So what's left at their disposal is the local legal systems, which are often, not functioning, not, able to carry out justice. You have very high levels of impunity and so on. So we actually don't have a case with Goldcorp in particular where there's been a successful legal case brought in Canada. There's been no such case.
Interestingly, though, hasn't a villager or at least members of the community of El Estor, haven't they just arrived in Canada to provide evidence? Yeah,
this is a precedent-setting court case, and they're basically charging another Canadian company called Hudbay Minerals, which was going to open a nickel mine in Guatemala, with criminal negligence. And this is related to the behavior of security guards in the employ of Hudbay's operation in Guatemala, who are accused of having killed one mine opponent and fatally wounded another, as well as a series of gang rapes which took place in another community which would be impacted by the mine.
Carol Moffat, I mean, we've talked about, for various reasons, for whatever reason then, the safeguards within Guatemala are pretty weak. What about the safeguards in Canada then, though, to ensure that corporations aren't exploitative?
Canada has created a national contact point under the OECD. We went to the national contact point within Canada on this case, and what we found was Canada did not take the issue seriously. They saw that this as a matter of the role of the national contact point within Canada as one of dialogue and mediation between the company and the community. And the problem that you have here is that the community is arguing, you took our land without our consent. So the foundational problem there is that this is not really a question for dialogue. But even beyond that, the national contact point within Canada showed no willingness to actually implement a serious investigation. And ultimately, we're constrained by the fact that even in countries that implement the OECD system well, what they do is produce findings and they do recommendations. They're not ultimately binding on the companies unless countries act within their domestic law to make them so.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Very
briefly, Dawn.
We refer to Canada as a judicial and a fiscal paradise for mining companies. It's a perfect operation, it's a perfect environment for them to operate because there isn't those same legal constraints that exist even in the United States.
Fascinating. Well, we'll have to follow that up. Dawn Paley, thank you very much. Luba Zarski, thank you.
Thank you.
Carol Muffett, thank you very much too. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.